thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you guys all for being here this morning. I'm really excited to be able to be part of the Nahar meetings. Finally, I don't have a teaching schedule that conflicts, so I can actually come in more. I'm really excited about that. So I'll be doing a fairly similar version to the talk that was presented at SHA with a little bit of more elaboration on some of the themes, just because it's a slightly longer venue than 15 minutes, which is nice. But, if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to, interject. And I guess we'll have a question and answer section at the end, right, Sarah? So.
Yes, and warning, I usually have a billion questions, but I think
Excellent.
someone else is facilitating that this morning, so enjoy the grilling.
Woo, awesome. All right, well, so let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get rolling. Let's see. All right, so hopefully that is showing for everybody. The actual view, not the presenter view. All right, righteous. So we've read the really long title, so we're gonna go ahead and move on into the slide content. So as everybody who's on this talk is probably already aware, there have been a lot of calls to action and efforts to try to model how climate change threats are addressed with archaeological resources, right? So, one of the big studies that gets cited, Dr. Anderson, thanks for being on the call this morning, is the PLOS One paper about sea level rise and archaeological site threats. So, papers like this, other research, the presentations of the numerous sessions over the last few years at conferences have highlighted how much risk cultural heritage resources are facing as a result of climate change, both in terms of present harm as well as imminent harms. So there are a range of different climatic factors that are contributing to this risk. Coastal climate factors obviously have been a really big area of study, but as the Beyond the Shoreline session that we were in for SHAs this year noted, there are a number of other climate threats that we're facing as well. So things like fires, increased erosion, intense freeze-thaw cycles, bioturbation, and what's the term? Faunal turbation was one of the great ones we got from a great paper at Texas.
Cryoturbation. Wow.
Cryoturbation, like there's just so many great, fantastic terms. So building on the talk from last week about, all the terms in climate change discourse, there's some really great ones out there. So a lot of these studies, again, highlight that there are a wide range of risks, that numerous resources are under threat. But when we're talking about vulnerability from the perspective of these models, a lot of the vulnerability considerations are focused on environmental settings that are at risk for change or loss, or the vulnerability of sites as resources in the context of that environmental change or loss. But there has been a less frequent consideration of additional vulnerabilities that are more structural in nature, and not structural in terms of like building structures, but structural in terms of structural violence. So considering how different communities, both in the past and present, disproportionately experience harm, and how that can then be, added on to our consideration of vulnerability in the face of climate change. So, the consideration of structural harm and vulnerability is something we're already doing pretty broadly in archaeological discourse and have been doing. And it's certainly not invisible in terms of how we think about weighting these different risk factors. But what I'll be talking about today is looking at how we can conjoin the conversations around risk and vulnerability from a climate change perspective with these other discourses that are happening in archaeology, so that we can approach the consideration of risk from a more equitable perspective. So let's see here. Screen dude. So, as we've noted with the broader discourse, there's a lot of patterns that have contributed to underrepresentation, historically for particular groups in the past. And because of that, we need to move from thinking about treating sites equally as, resources on a map that are under threat, and thinking about things from more of an equity or, restorative justice and social justice kind of perspective. Because if we emphasize this equal treatment, we are not necessarily trying to address those structural risks and ensuring that there is a better balance in terms of preservation efforts going forward. We also need to recognize that as we are continuing to engage and collaborate and uplift communities who have been historically underrepresented, that their interests and their connection to these sites has incredible merit, and that those conversations need to be included into discussions of climate change preservation policies. So what we'll be doing for this talk is highlighting a couple instances of vulnerability as case studies. This is obviously a very broad area. There are a number of different sites and communities that we could talk about, but for the sake of time, we'll focus on a case study of looking at, oh gosh, I wrote pre-contact, I meant post-contact Indigenous sites, maroon communities, and then we'll focus on looking at how archaeological practice can unintentionally reify these marginalizing practices through a look at modeling potential from the Great Dismal Swamp, which, we chose the Great Dismal Swamp because it represents quite a lot of these archaeological resources that are at risk. The low-lying nature of it means it is, pretty imminently at risk for climate change threats, and also because it really highlights some of the limitations in current modeling practices and survey methodologies that are contributing to these oversights that we experience. So let's see. So let's talk about the post-contact settlements first. So Indigenous communities and Indigenous sites have long been of archaeological interest. That cannot be understated. But the challenge is that a lot of the emphasis and interest on Indigenous sites has been on pre-contact components, less so on the post-contact iterations of Indigenous settlement. So according to DINA, in recent studies, it looks like only about 2,108 sites of more than 73,000 sites documented in the Mid-Atlantic region, just in the Mid-Atlantic region alone, have what are called a post-contact component. And the trouble with these post-contact components is that they're largely concentrated on the colonial period. There's less understanding of post-contact sites as we start to experience removal and migration and forced migration of Indigenous peoples across the landscape. And then we combine that with the fact that a lot of these post-contact settlements are often in shoreline settings, increases the vulnerability of these sites, as well as the data potential that they retain. It's also important to consider that in broader cultural and spatial contexts, Indigenous placemaking isn't limited to particular points on the map where we're finding artifacts, right? We know this. This is, again, not something that's necessarily new to archaeological discourse broadly. But in terms of thinking about cultural heritage resources and how we're having these conversations in climate change discourse about how to, more broadly encompass the kinds of cultural heritage resources at risk, we need to, continue to emphasize Indigenous placemaking in the context of Indigenous cultural landscapes. So, these landscapes, meaning, the broader cultural reflections of value and attachment that communities have, as well as reflections of the broader relationships that Indigenous communities have with interacting with various parts of the landscape. So in terms of trying to identify these resources beyond just the archaeological manifestations of specific concentrations, a big part of identifying these landscapes is collaboration with descendant communities. So by applying ICL or using an Indigenous cultural landscape approach, we work outside of more traditional methodologies that increase our collaboration with these communities, increase their representation in conversations around preservation and site significance assessments, and allow us to create broader understandings of risk and harm. And especially when we consider that sometimes the threats to Indigenous cultural landscapes might be less tangible. So it might not be as simple as a site that's eroding out into the water, or that, is, being burned, and the vegetation on the landscape is changing, but it's the cumulative effects of these different kinds of losses and changes, as well as compounded changes and erasures that happen from non-climate change sources that cause damage to the broader landscapes and places of meaning for Indigenous cultures. So it's important, again, to take a much more holistic perspective and contextualizing significance and thinking about the range of threats that these resources are facing. And as far as the value for the communities, being able to tie into material places and to particular landscapes has incredible value for communities that are seeking federal recognition. And the loss of these sites, if we think about these sites, in the material sense, as well as the broader sense, the loss of these resources means that communities have a harder time gaining recognition and connecting that, continuity and that history to particular places. So again, thinking about the sites that are of immediate value and immediate risk to Indigenous communities is particularly salient, as they try to work through these broader structural processes that can be incredibly challenging, time-consuming, resource-intensive, to ensure that they have as many resources as we can, assist with to make the claims that they need to make. So for example, in like the region we're talking about with the Great Dismal Swamp, the Chesapeake, the Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, there are a total of 8 federally recognized tribes in Virginia, North Carolina, and 22 in North Carolina, in addition to numerous state recognized tribes. Despite the fact that we know from historical documentation that there are, and from traditional knowledge, there are dozens, hundreds more indigenous communities that are not accounted for in that recognition. So trying to, again, increase our allyship and increase the work that we're doing in support of descendant community agendas is incredibly important. And that holds true when we look at marine sites, although there's a slightly different range of pressures as well as considerations when we look at this resource type as compared to post-contact indigenous sites. So marine communities, for those who might not be as familiar, are essentially clandestine settlements that are comprised of people who have escaped from enslavement and live apart from the constraints of institutionalized slavery. So marinage goes hand in hand with the processes of colonialism in that it occurs wherever slavery existed on short and long-term scales and in varying degrees of complexity and establishment. So there's been a fairly limited study of marinage through an archaeological context. There's been more interest in it recently, and actually there was a great paper at the SHAs this year talking about how we can model marine site identification and location using least cost networks. So I would encourage anybody to check that out. It's by Tara Skipton. I think she's a grad student at Texas. But either way, by studying the archaeology of marinage, it allows us to get outside these narratives that reify, instances of violence and oppression and really focus on more diverse experiences of self-emancipation and resistance and empowerment for communities that are diasporically African and Afro-descendant. That again gets away from viewing people as objects of labor within these particularly plantation, contexts. So marinage is a pretty widespread activity. By the 18th century, documentary sources indicate that dozens of communities had been established within the South, and that's the ones that we have documentary evidence of, not counting the countless others that are not accounted for in the written record. These communities typically, because of the clandestine nature of their creation, are formed in low-lying, out-of-the-way places that are less accessible generally to avoid detection and to limit the likelihood of inadvertent discovery. So areas like swamps, coastal islands are typically places where we would expect to find these sites. So in the Great Dismal Swamp, for example, there's some really prevalent marine communities that have been documented. And Daniel Sayers, who's written a lot about the archaeology in the Great Dismal Swamp, has some great resources talking about the archaeology of marinage there in that context. And so we see a pretty large communities of marinage cropping up in the Great Dismal Swamp and persisting for fairly long periods of time, well through commercial logging efforts that take place right around the end of the Civil War. So these members of the marine communities were really successful in negotiating contracts with people who were taking part in industrial efforts on the forest. So in terms of creating niches for subsistence and thriving, in addition to just, attempting to survive, these really, again, very empowering narratives of resistance and community construction coming out of these sites. But because of the nature of where these sites are located in these low-lying areas, which are typically considered low potential by a lot of archaeological modeling, and because they can be fairly ephemeral, the ones in the Great Dismal Swamp certainly are much larger, and when you've got a larger community and a longer-term settlement, they can have a more visible impact on the archaeological record that we can see. But still, because our methodology really isn't operating around detection of sites like these, it's hard for them to be documented systematically through traditional survey, and it leads to an underrepresentation of these sites in the archaeological record. So when these sites are, continue to be underrepresented in the archaeological record, we see that, again, there's a consideration that the landscapes in which they occur are valued less compared to other landscapes and settings where there are more documented archaeological resources. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these kinds of aspects of archaeological practice and predictive modeling and how they fit in structurally. And then we can talk about some ways that we can try to change that and change that using methods that are really already at play, but operating in parallel, kinds of discourse rather than integrated. So there are two, oh golly, let's just give you the whole talk in speed. There are two aspects of bias that we're looking at here. So one is the idea that most models that assess climate change risk and really assess archaeological risk broadly can be somewhat reductionistic. So things that emphasize general site distributions can often homogenize what those sites are, as well as spatially constrained experiences of the landscape. So again, tying those broader cultural landscapes that have value for the descendant communities, as well as the past communities that created them and experienced them, to areas where material remains are evident, right? It's also important to understand, if people are maybe less in tune with doing predictive modeling and modeling discourse, that these models are a big part of how threat is assessed and how preservation strategies are created and conceived and actioned out. So when we think about models as being reductionistic and focusing on a limited nature of site types, as well as like the parameters of what constructs a site or what constitutes a heritage resource, we're missing a lot of the picture with these models. And I mean, there are studies that talk about GIS and the limits that GIS often has in terms of emphasizing points on the map and homogenizing experiences. But, there have been counter studies in GIS that have, engaged communities like counter mapping projects. Gonzalez-Tennant has been doing a lot of great work with this, that draw in other perspectives beyond the archaeological perspective to more inclusively map space, as well as to try to avoid some of the inherent limitations of thinking about maps in a cartographic, constrained context. So another bias that we encounter as well in predictive modeling is that our site detection strategies are guided by information that we already have. So we create these feedback groups where we have settings that have produced high numbers of archaeological sites. So we use those settings to emphasize those kinds of areas as having greater likelihood than areas that we don't have documented resources in, without really thinking about what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of strategies are underpinning those decisions and those representations of sites in certain settings than others. It's not always the case that some areas just have more sites than others, which is commonly what a lot of people think when we think about site modeling potential. Really, part of that can be reflected by an emphasis on looking for certain types of sites while not really considering a broader spectrum of archaeological potential and archaeological site types, as we mentioned with the ruined communities, for example. So a lot of these state models typically, construct archaeological potential under like what are called high, intermediate, or intermediate and low or indeterminate probability. So the categories are typically driven by differences in slope grade and soil drainage classification, based on large data studies, again, of where known sites have been recorded. So if lots of sites have been recorded in well-drained areas as opposed to poorly drained areas, then areas with well-drained soils would be considered higher potential for archaeological sites than areas with low drainage, right? Pretty straightforward. So again, because these frequencies are dependent on what we know, we don't know what we are missing because we are reinforcing, again, what we think we know about archaeological potential. And there have been studies that talk about the limits of predictive modeling and attempts to broaden out predictive models to account for a broader range of site types, as well as to adjust the methodologies for how those different settings of high prob versus low prob are differentially surveyed, right? But there's still a lot of change that needs to happen. And looking at the state guidelines for a number of states in the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, we looked at Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. A lot of the potential models and the survey strategy recommendations emphasize more intensive survey and testing in areas that are determined to have high potential than areas that have low potential. And so in these areas of low potential, you might see methodologies that range from digging shovel tests at greater intervals, so maybe 60 meters instead of 30 meters, or conducting pedestrian walkover or augering in particular settings to confirm stratigraphic sequences. But again, the broad nature of coverage in low probability areas ensures that sites that would be located in those settings, like marine communities, for example, would be less likely to be detected. So even though those areas still do get surveyed, we have to rethink how those coverages can continue to reinforce the idea that those settings do not have archaeological material or archaeological potential. Now, in the context of climate change models, there's a number of these models that are being advanced. We highlighted two in the Southeast just for the sake of time. So there's one by Robinson et al. That was done in 2010 looking at models of the Georgia coast, and they drew on sites that had been recommended eligible for the National Register under Criterion D, and plotted the locations of the sites and looked at where those site settings were, and then what the relative threat of those site locations were from coastal climate change. Of course, there are some limitations with this. Again, limitations that we've been discussing. Criterion D, as we're beginning to realize, is not the only consideration for significance with archaeological sites and cultural heritage resources, especially because data can be subjective, and the emphasis on D and data can often focus our attention on how much material culture is left behind in a site, rather than considering the broader significance that those sites have in terms of their historical associations, the people attached to those sites, their connection to broader historical events. And so looking at sites that have broader significances is important in trying to, again, think about the different structural efforts and values that are put on archaeological and cultural heritage resources. Again, also, like we talked about with the biases and models, emphasizing particular site locations can be limiting as well, because again, we're not capturing the broader landscapes of meaning for communities in the past and present. To pick on Dave again, his study from PLOS One, again, uses known site locations. They have a really large data set of site locations they're using, and it wasn't determined based on significance. But they do note that, again, because many sites are not necessarily present or many site types might be underrepresented, because of these limitations in coverage and methods, models like these need to be used with a grain of salt, which we would agree with. There needs to be a consideration, again, of the broader factors than just site location and particular aspects of significance. So, and looking at the Great Dismal Swamp, let's see what I'm doing on time. Okay. We decided to just try out the state model for archaeological potential and see how the Great Dismal Swamp particularly would fall in terms of high, low, and indeterminate probability. And then to assess, what the potential risks to that setting were. So we chose the Great Dismal Swamp because it embodies a lot of these more marginalized site types and descendant groups that we've been talking about in this presentation. The Great Dismal Swamp has, between 1630 and 1865, thousands of Maroons, enslaved canal company laborers, and disenfranchised indigenous groups who had been removed from ancestral landscapes. So again, all these site types that we're talking about and more would be present on this landscape as we understand from, the historical, oral, and documentary record. Now, looking at the potential models that Virginia uses, low probability is determined based on these two factors here: the presence of poorly drained soils and slopes that are greater than 15%. Now, luckily with the swamp, there's not slopes greater than 15%, so that factor was not really a big consideration in modeling the potential of the Great Dismal Swamp. However, the low-lying nature of the setting means that the majority of it is poorly drained. And so a total of 97.1% of the swamp actually would qualify as having low potential based on these standards. And that's not to say that surveys, when the entire project area would be conducted at a really low frequency because the entire area is low potential, but it does mean that survey methodologies might be less discriminating if the expectation is that there are not archaeological resources there. So again, a large part, oh, golly, a large portion of this would be potentially overlooked just using, the standards, the methodologies that are extant for the state. So, so rather than showing you a map where the entire map is, one color because it's low potential, we use these statistics here. But on the next slide, I've got a map that shows how risks from coastal climate change, which is one of the more imminent risks for the Great Dismal Swamp, would differentially affect different parts of this landscape. So, okay. So not an unfamiliar map in terms of, looking at maps of coastal climate change threat, but in looking at broadly, rates of sea level rise without discriminating for different micro locational settings, we just broadly looked at rates of sea level rise at 1 meter intervals to see what portions of the Great Dismal Swamp, both the historical boundary of it, which was much larger, as well as the modern managed boundary of the Great Dismal Swamp would be. So as you can see from both the map and from the table, there's not a massive amount of risk that happens at the 1 meter level, and even really at 2 meters of sea level rise. But as we get upwards into 3, 4, 5 meters of sea level rise, we are seeing that quite a large portion of both the historical and the modern boundary are affected. And so while we might think, okay, well, it's going to take a while for sea levels to get up to, 3, 4, 5 meters from where they are today. Many of us know that things like king tides and storm surges can push, sea levels and erosional factors further inland and at higher rates during instantaneous moments of disaster. So while it, overall the inundation of this landscape might take a while, these sorts of, singular immediate effects from storm surges and king tides would absolutely affect the current landscape of the Great Dismal Swamp and would facilitate greater erosion, which means that there is less, potential for these resources to be documented as sites on a map, and the overall integrity of these cultural landscapes becomes, adversely affected as well. So, so we're losing potentially quite a lot of opportunity to, change how we think about looking at archaeological site detection and changing how we engage with, communities in the past and the present to try to understand the cultural significance of these landscapes and document and preserve and, hopefully try to mitigate the risk posed by climate change to these kinds of landscapes. Now, and thinking about what we can do, we've got this information, how do we move forward from here? Changing all of this practice at a very large level is an intimidating task. But fortunately, there are a lot of great initiatives already happening, both in archaeology broadly and in climate change discourse and archaeology that we can use to combat these threats now. So given that BIPOC individuals, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color are already generally excluded from dominant historical narratives, the physical loss of these resources and landscapes can facilitate and accelerate the erasure of their history, right? And as we've mentioned, the loss of these resources creates additional harm for descendant communities, especially as we work towards creating more equitable recognition, both in the archaeological record and through public-facing means. And because we lack systems that more equitably locate these resources, we don't know the full extent to which climate change is threatening them. So in terms of increasing the collaborative efforts that we have as archaeologists with community stakeholders, we need to really be, paying attention to the community stakeholders that typically fall outside of preservation policy making. So these historically marginalized groups that don't often have a seat at the table. And in other areas of archaeological practice are gaining a greater seat at the table. Again, it's just bringing that change and that, initiative into climate change discourse. So as we're all aware, there are a number of great citizen science efforts, heritage monitoring scouts, the Maine Mid-Miners, which we'll be learning about, here in the next few weeks, the Scottish Coastal Heritage at Risk project as well. All of these efforts are very active, engaging large numbers of the community, drawing attention to the risk of climate events to heritage sites that are at risk, and in terms of helping to create an interest in preservation, right? But unfortunately, we're seeing that as a treatment of archaeological sites broadly. And so finding ways to draw in the communities, the descendant communities whose particular heritage sites are facing greater degrees of vulnerability is an important agenda that we should be considering with these citizen science initiatives, as well as finding ways for the work that is being done and developed from these programs to be, incorporated into how we can address the structural vulnerability of these different resources. And thinking about ways we can identify and detect resources that addresses the underrepresentation of certain site types in the archaeological record. So, like I said, these collaborations really help to strengthen the awareness of what resources get excluded due to reliance on traditional methods. It helps us to understand the different degrees of risk that marginalized communities are facing from climate change factors. As we recognize that the physical loss of these landscapes and these material culture assemblages are facilitating and accelerating erasure, it's important that we include the communities whose heritage is being lost in thinking about how we discuss preservation, how we discuss, potential, how we understand the significance, and then how we triage the different types of preservation strategies that we enact to mitigate climate threat. So finding ways that we can bring in these discussions of equity from archaeological discourse broadly into climate change is something that needs to be prioritized now, especially as we are facing the immediate risks in the present from climate change. And we're seeing that some of the existing models for climate change risk being implemented, finding ways to then implement these broader conversations it really cannot be understated. So that is all I have. Thank you.